Welcome to latest edition of All People's Health Collective podcast. We are joined today by our comrade Vanessa Ramos, who's also one of the folks who started this whole thing and got the jump off going. And so we're going to talk today about an issue that gets consistently distorted and misrepresented intentionally all the time, and also has a variety of points of view and frameworks on how to talk about it, address it, deal with it, etc. And that issue is substance use, and then the issue of addiction, where some people think it's synonymous and some people would argue otherwise. And as always, these things are just very complex. So before we get into it, Vanessa, would love for you to introduce yourself and tell us anything you want us to know about yourself and about your current work.
Thank you, Lex. Thank you for all that you do, and thank you for having me. It's a great honor and privilege for me to be here. I just want to start with a big old thank you to you for evolving what once started in a very small way with very big intention. Um, your leadership has allowed this not to be like the road to hell is paved with good intention, but for it to be paved appropriately. So I can't thank you enough for having me, but for all that you're doing. My name is Vanessa Ramos. I'm based out of Los Angeles, California, but I like going around to different states and fuck it, even different countries, you know? I mean, shit, I ain't scared. Um, the most important thing that I want you and like all the listeners to know is that I'm a mother first and foremost. I say that and I want to frame it that way. I also next want you to know that I'm a woman living with different disabilities that are sometimes more visible than others. And I want to frame it that way because in this conversation, I want to back into health and health solutions, um, which is a huge component of our work collectively through the All People's Health Collective. And that's a lot of what my work at Disability Rights California is based in. It's based in, solutions, health solutions. Um, so that's what I'm doing.
I appreciate that, and thank you back. And thank you for all the work that you do. I know it's always hard when people ask us what we do, because it's like when someone asks you to describe yourself, I'm like, I don't know, ask other people to describe me. And so I say that to say that I've seen the kind of work you do, the work you do on the ground, the work you do all over the country, and it's why so much trust has been built. And so I just appreciate very much your commitment to impacts. And I know we talk a lot about in All People's Health Collective that that's really all we care about is impact. We have to make impact, and impact has to be made. So, I think that I want to name a thing because when I first met you, it struck me as familiar, is that you're from Hollywood. And I'm from a lot of parts of LA. I grew up all over Los Angeles, including Hollywood. And, there's certain parts of the country, there's certain neighborhoods and certain cities around the country where sometimes you can tell when someone's from there. And certain neighborhoods have such a vibe, certain areas give people such a vibe. So when I met you, I right away was like, oh, she's from Hollywood. I know that person. So I think that's a good place for us to start, actually. So, of course, when I say Hollywood, I'm not talking about, uh, you know, the Warner Brothers backlot. I'm not talking about Hollywood as what people imagine the film industry, because we also call that Hollywood, and that there's a reason for that. There was a time when all the film studios were in Hollywood. I'm talking about Hollywood, the community, the neighborhood in Los Angeles, which yes, it still actually has some of those studios, but the majority of it is far different than what people imagine. And Hollywood's a good place for us to start if we're going to talk about things like substance use and things like addiction and things like state violence, because Hollywood is probably one of the most concentrated areas where you see those issues play out on the street, in the community. It's statistically always been one of the areas as far as like highest amounts of drug use, highest amounts of incidents. It's a community that at times in LA's history has been not one of the most violent communities in LA, but at times the most violent community in LA. There was a time in the early 90s, I believe, when Wilcox and Yucca was like the most violent intersection in the city. And I think a lot of people don't know that. And it's neither here nor there because I don't always feel comfortable talking about violence anyway, because how we imagine a neighborhood's or city's safety, how it gets talked about in the news, isn't really reflective of the reality anyway. But there's a reason that it's so concentrated there. Well, I should say there are many reasons it's concentrated there. There are very fascinating immigration histories in that area, very fascinating histories around policing. By fascinating, in that case, I mean bad. And in any case, it's an area where these issues live, and it's an area where you're from. So let's start there because I want to hear from you. How did some of your experience and analysis around an issue of around issues like substance use, for example, get shaped maybe by some of your origin of being from a community where it's happening at such a complex, deep, and high level?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Lex. I recently ran like my ancestry and me, and I know like that's like not preferred. They're like, oh my God, they're gonna like clone you. I'm like, that might be a good thing with my big headed ass, you know? I'm like, should I scare motherfuckers?
We need more Vanessas.
We need more Lexes, you know? And the reason why I'm so bold about, who I am and my authenticity and just owning, how the good Lord made me, is because, I'm a product of rape. My mom was my dad growing up, right? My mom was is from Honduras. And she migrated here with her siblings. Um, many years ago. And when she first migrated here and she was introduced, into like the American school system, as you can imagine, like there was language barriers and things of that sort. But what my mom was concealing from my family is that she was also queer. And when my mom was at Hollywood High, she fully came out as queer. And that was in the 70s, right? In the 70s, you didn't have Central American women, cutting down their hair and adopting a boyish look. My mom and her girlfriend ran away to Hollywood, and unfortunately, masculine lesbian women were being raped, and that was a form of, oh, I'm gonna show you, you know, it, you know the deal. Well, a part of my mother's journey was falling in love like everyone else. And when it came to supporting her family, she sold drugs. I know that the way that my mother was able to find meaning and purpose for our family wasn't derived in criminality, but it was derived from the same ways that maybe your family, derived from, right? Like we need money to eat, we need to pay our rent, and people weren't just going to hire my mom. So very proudly, I come from a drug culture, and very proudly, I say that Salvador Dali often says, I don't do drugs, I am drugs. So drugs, I understand, have been highly criminalized. The war on drugs stems from, racial things. And some of my sisters, may be coming in the background. So sorry not to be too disruptive, but we have two very powerful women that are entering this space, we're all here in Minnesota. I'm sorry if this is disruptive. Please join the conversation. But my mom really introduced me to mobility. Carolina Valle talked about upward mobility, right? And what we need to do to ascend. Drugs were a part of that, right? Drugs is something that my mom learned how to sell. Her wife unfortunately learned how to use it. I became addicted, as a young teen. And today I know that it was a form of medicine for me. And then when I learned how to sell drugs and transport, it was a form of currency. I've spent my many years in recovery, and I understand that not only do we recover, but that there's many people that use drugs, and then there's some people that abuse drugs, right? And different treatment approaches are available. But for me, I had to figure that out for myself in community, which is why I love you so much, Lex. You understand the deep meaning of mutual aid and how no one takes care of us like we take care of ourselves. So I don't know if that answered some of it or all of it, but that's just a
You,
little
you
bit
made,
about my upbringing.
you made such a good point about upward mobility, and that there's there's there are folks who get to do upward mobility above board and folks who don't get to do upward mobility above board. And you mentioned immigration stories too, like different waves of migrants over the years had to resort to, underground economies in order to establish themselves. And we know that when folks don't have a lot of options and they need money, they resort to all kinds of forms of survival. And the drug market, the drug economy, obviously has always been one of them. Side note, you mentioning your mom went to Hollywood High. Um, funny that we're both generationally. My Not only did my dad go to Hollywood High, my grandfather went to Hollywood High. It's funny this Hollywood thing for us to be talking about. You also mentioned, addiction happening to you at a young age. And so I think that that's just a really good segue because we're in this moment, and I started by talking about how, Hollywood's an area of a high rate of incidence. Things are very visible there. Hollywood has always been one of the very high concentrated areas of unhoused people, high concentrations of visible poverty. And those are the areas that get scrutinized. And so people often have this narrative, and the narrative gets weaponized so much politically that, oh, folks are homeless because they're on drugs. They're homeless because of their mental health issues. And then there's another conversation, there's an argument, there's a reply to that. It says, no, folks are having mental health issues because they're homeless. Folks are using drugs because they're homeless, not the other way around. What we do know is true is that poverty, economic destabilization, poverty creates a certain level of stress that folks who've been through it understand. I mean, there's no stress like financial stress. And the stress around how am I going to participate in society without the necessary resources? How am I going to support my family? How am I going to put food on the table? When that gets thrown into question, everybody's mental health becomes very challenged. And when you said, self-medication through drugs, that's often the case. People start to chase the fantasy that this substance that might momentarily make some of that pain or anxiety go away is going to always work the same way it did that time that it felt good. And they start chasing whatever it is that makes that feeling that can feel so hard to deal with go away. These are all conversations that happen all the time about substance use and addiction. What we find is that these conversations get weaponized in the context of policy. And the areas that they use to weaponize that are the areas where it's visible. So areas like Skid Row, Venice, Hollywood, that's Los Angeles. A lot of other big cities have their version of it. The Tenderloin up in San Francisco, uh, in Philadelphia, there's that neighborhood Kensington. Areas where it's very visible, people they film it, they take pictures of it, and then they try to call it an example of failed policy or blame the person who's visibly unwell. So you mentioned that being, your own experience. So what would you say to somebody who says, "Oh, Hollywood, let's just talk about Hollywood because we're both vibing on Hollywood. Oh, Hollywood has a lot of homeless people because they're drug addicts." How would you talk about the relationship between poverty, substance use, and addiction?
Yeah, and thank you for that question. I'll
And
say for me in Hollywood, you know, to that question, like, oh, people are drug addicts because or people are homeless because they are addicts or because they're mentally ill, right? And it's like, yeah, some are. That's true. Some are. Right? Like I'm a realist, but in being a realist, I just want you to know that when I was hoeing upscale, when I was at the Chateau Marmar, it was fancy. I was doing the same drugs, even probably higher amounts. I mean, shout out Charlie Sheen, right? Like that is family to me. Like I get it, dude. I get having more and being around people who maybe don't get it, who aren't connecting to you in a real way, right? Like maybe that had something to do because when we get away, sometimes this life becomes so fake. And I think in movement spaces, like you'll know, right? Like real things become real fake, real quick, right? And sometimes it's like I know how to feel right like that. I know how to feel better just like that, and in a rig in my vein preferred, right? Just for me, but the same drugs, the same method of use when I was seeing better days, right? Or the same drugs, same form of use that I used in poverty and in impoverished communities. And at different stages of my life, for me, I've been able to connect the dots how it's not necessarily drug use that's stigmatized, it's poor people stigmatized. It's not drug use that's necessarily stigmatized, it's like who's doing it, right? So we've created a culture of like, if I can benefit from your ass staying high or drunk, right? I'm gonna support that in a way that's very different than it is when it's in a impoverished setting, right? For me, being able to be a mother, the reason why I named that as so important to me is because women like me, right, aren't supposed to raise kids, right? I'm rowdy like that. I got two kids by two different baby daddies. I might fuck around and get a third. I'm not sure. Maybe, hopefully, hopefully because I'm a maternal being, right? And my drug use has nothing to do, right, with who I am as a person. But if I'm rich, if I'm highly, and when I say rich, if I reach a certain level of wage scale or what have you, then all of a sudden it's okay. I could have many kids with different dads, right? I could use any drug, right? As long as I make it look a certain way, right? And I think that those realities are something that are fundamentally visible when we look at the Department of Children and Family Services system, right? When we look at the foster care system, my sister here does great work in Minnesota, right? With foster youth and with communities that oftentimes get put to the side. And Lex, when we vibe and when we talk about peer support, right, and the importance of that mutual aid and how like we came up helping each other and how those sports programs, right, that were taxpayer funded, how that helps community, but how when that got taken away, those kids had no sports to play, so they ended up playing on the streets, and then they called it a gang, right? And the oftentimes I'm not making excuses for some of our bad behavior, right? Because some of the things that I did, fuck that, don't do that around my neighborhood. Like, I will say something like, no, I don't want chaos, right? But the why, right, is it's that same why that leads me to connect the dots of today I have access to therapy. Now that I'm well resourced, I have access to therapy. I have access to medications, right? When I was down and out, I didn't have access to therapy. So when we'd get high, we'd fucking sit there and talk through it, right? We needed that kind of human connection. Um, and
You,
and
you,
and we had our medication. We knew how to get right.
you're speaking to something. I mean, you're making some fundamental points that take a complex conversation and make it not complex. Because what you said, it's not about drug use, it's about who's doing them. And we talked about scrutiny. And you just said another thing too about companionship in space. So we don't get to have these conversations honestly very often. So I want to start with the first thing you said about not the what, but the who. And you mentioned like, Chateau Marmont, for example, and space mediated by wealth versus space mediated by poverty. I think most people who grew up in poor and working class communities grew up around uh, people maybe selling drugs to make money or a drug economy. I can say that for myself. But I'll tell you that what you just said is true for me too, which is I never saw as much drugs being consumed until the first time I was invited to like a wealthy private school party when I had a friend as a teenager took me to a party where kids with a lot of money were hanging out. I had never seen so many drugs in my life and never seen so much consumption in my life. So right away, the math doesn't add up when people say, oh, folks on the street not doing well, it's because they're drug addicts. We know that drugs get used inside of nice houses, drugs get used inside of nice institutions, drugs are consumed in fancy universities, probably much more than they're consumed at, say, the community college. Chateau Marmont is in Hollywood, but it's closer over there to the Strip, where probably more drugs get used there than get used over on, Santa Monica and Vermont. So it's not it's not true. It's just simply not true that folks are on the street because they're drug addicts. Now, you said some of them, I'm a realist. Yeah, there are some folks who are on the streets because they have maybe failed out of programming, but one could also argue that the initial reasons they had to enter into that programming did not start with them being on the street because they were using, started with there being no place for a person to go versus somebody who's having struggles with addiction or substance use who do have somewhere to go. Because what we all understand is that somebody struggling with addiction is a very personal and not a carbon copy experience. Families, the most wealthy families in the world and the most impoverished families in the world all have members of their family that struggle with addiction and mental health issues. Mental health and addiction issues don't necessarily discriminate. How they are experienced, however, is very mediated, and this is what I'm hearing you say. How one experiences these issues is very mediated by their experience of class, of whether they're wealthy or whether they're experiencing poverty. And that goes to another thing you said that I think was so insightful, and just folks just don't, for some reason, want to talk about it, or they don't understand it, or it feels too vulnerable to talk about, which is how much of it has to do with companionship. If you talk to anyone who really experienced addiction, one of the things, once folks get going, once folks get comfortable and folks are talking, one of the things they'll tell you was their favorite part of using was the ritual and the companionship. What's most people's favorite part of drinking coffee in the morning? It's the ritual. It's the idea that there's something for you to do in the morning. The smell of the coffee. Some people like to grind their beans. Some people like to do a pour over. Some people like their espresso machine. Most folks will admit that the coffee stopped working a long time ago. I didn't drink coffee till I had kids. And I remember when I was tired, I had a baby, I was young, and I had a cup of coffee for the first time. I was like, oh, wow, that really worked. That coffee doesn't work the same way for me now, all these years later, but I still enjoy the ritual. And ritual also builds community. And for most people, I don't want to say for most people, for a lot of people who have maybe more support in their life, more resources in their life, which allows maybe their family or their chosen family or their community to stabilize, then they get to have ritual. You mentioned being maternal. A lot of us as parents, one of our favorite things to do is to do our best to create enough stability to enjoy a holiday or a ritual, getting folks together or sitting around the table. And so for a lot of folks who have gotten to a point in their life where they have nothing, using is that. Oh, I found another person we both use together. We have our little ritual, whatever the substance that they're using in, a little ritual and a little bit of community forms. And if they're in a situation where they're being very scrutinized for scrutinized for drug consumption, scrutinized for the lifestyle that they're living, scrutinized for the visible poverty that they're experiencing, scrutinized for ways that they're choosing to make money in order to survive. Then they seek out that companionship around something like, let's say, substance use. And there's that added layer of companionship, which is that, oh, we're not judging each other right now. We're in this together. And all of this is a response to an absence of support, because the other thing you said was how young people are denied things to do. And we're seeing a huge push for that right now, where all these emergency curfew ordinances, this narrative coming from, from the administration, the current presidential administration, but certainly not unique to it's not unique to Trump. Every political administration that I know of does this, including, Gavin Newsom in California does it too, where
Joe
they tell
Biden, you about the crime bill, right? Shit.
exactly, they tell you that crime is out of control, they tell you to be afraid, and they target youth in doing so. And so they create a criminalization of public space that targets mostly, black teenagers, brown teenagers, and excludes people from what is supposed to be public space under the guise that they're not safe, because all it takes is a few teenagers acting stupid in public for people to turn on the camera and say, oh, see, we're not safe. Does that reflect in the reality around, is crime worse now than it was 20 years ago? Absolutely not. Things are way safer than there used to be. But what they do capitalize on is that mentality, that exclusive mentality. This bleeds into a deeper conversation about gentrification, where you're bringing suburban exclusivity into urban space. Oh, we want to come back into the city now, but we want to act exclusive like we did when we lived in the suburbs, and you start marginalizing public space. But all this to say, the denial of stuff to do, the denial of access, the denial of community. You talk a lot, Vanessa, about banishment, the denial of any ability to engage. People forget that when you get to access public space, that's how you meet people. That's how you build your network. That's how you can potentially even pull yourself out of poverty. If you're excluded, folks start seeking community in much more risky ways. So I'm reflecting back to you all of the things that you said that I feel like really help create a much more comprehensive idea of how we talk about substance use and how we talk about things like addiction. But you also said before we got on camera that people forget that there's a difference between substance use and addiction. And I was using the term SUD. They call it substance use disorder. These are terms formulated in academia, formulated by police, formulated by lawyers, formulated in policy space. And then they ask people to then talk as if the policy space is supposed to dictate how we get to process this. So that's how we end up using a term like substance use disorder, whether that term makes sense to us or not. So I would love to hear from you. If you're talking to me, and let's say I'm just like a random person coming up to you and saying, what do they mean? What do they mean? What's the difference between substance use disorder, addiction, and then just substance use? How would you want someone to understand that?
Yeah, thanks for that question, and I want to just say that my sister here, Lucina, in working with the youth, Lex, I know that a lot of the work that you do, and she's got her master's in social work, right, sis? But like with connection and youth, right? Like those youth programs that you all lead, you do that, and what are those results that you see? And I'll get to exactly what your second question was, Lex. But just really quickly, will you oh yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh yeah, plug this again.
Oh, thank you.
Nice to meet you, Lex.
Sorry.
Great to meet you too. Thanks for joining it.
So I run an organization called Atlas of Blackness. We work with current and former foster youth and formerly incarcerated Black youth. We have a journalism program and a film and research program. And just going off of what you spoke about uh, around like criminalizing public space, one of the research we're actually doing right now is looking at how the highway system impacted Black life in Minnesota, specifically, is now currently impacting gentrification here, right? And the criminalization of public space for Black and Brown youth, and which then we have elders, even Black elders, because like when you criminalize Black youth, you also criminalize the thought process of our elders and our young people. And one of the ways that the child welfare system does that so works hand in hand with the prison system is when you criminalize these public spaces, you're almost creating a perfect pipeline for the prison system for those young people, right? Because you are literally severing ties to these intergenerational spaces for them. For our young people, how are they supposed to know that they're not supposed to interact with certain things? Even certain, like I have young folks who are don't even recognize that they're allergic to liquor, right? That for a lot of Black people, our genetics, like we're allergic to these things, right? And that's how they have certain chronic illness just from drinking beer. You wouldn't know that unless you're in community with your elders, for your elders to tell you these things. And so what we're seeing here now in Minnesota is the criminalization of just not only public parks, but communal spaces. Like youth have no way to be even in a library with each other because that's criminalized here. They have no way of just being able to be with their elders. So then they have like this disdain and this hatred for their elders. And then the elders vice versa. And so I would love for you to actually talk more about because as a therapist who works with a lot of young people who are coming out of the corrections system, and a lot of my clients have developed addiction because they were placed in those facilities. Some of my clients, they were removed by CPS, and the CPS was like, your homes were unsafe. Your parents are addicts. But their parents never exposed them to those drugs. They were exposed to those drugs while they're in those facilities. And that's when they developed their own addiction. So yeah,
Yeah.
the question
No,
I
yeah.
love for you to talk about.
Yeah, just like this is such a powerful dynamic, and I just love Lex how you are a national strategist, my brother, and like I feel like just very naturally and organically, like I'm so proud to zoom in from Minnesota and Lucina, like I just have to I'm a hugger, right? Like I just
Here,
have to hug you. Like she already I like that is this like when I have connection, the way that I love myself is different because you're teaching me that there's parts of me that are salvageable, right? So for me personally, the difference between substance use and addiction has been monstrosized by we're in the drug prohibition eras. Once upon a time, it was illegal to drink alcohol. You would go to speakeasies. You had to know the secret password, right? And people were what we are now, what's very common going to a bar, having a drink happy hour, right? We have happy hour, we have bars. What are you gonna do? It's a part of being cool, right? Like I have to, fuck around and go around town with y'all drinking, ginger ale over ice and shit, right? So people don't question my drink, right? But you all have such a great time, whiskey or, scotch, right? Like everyone has their signature dish, right? But like when you ask me, like I love a speedball. Like, I love Primo. When Whitney Houston was talking about Primo, I was like, preach this. Yes, like if you know, you know, right? When Charlie Sheen was so proud of like that I smoked like these like a certain amount, right? Of crack. Like, dude, that is my brother. Like I love I love Charlie Sheen. Like his worst for me is his best because that was he was moving towards his own purity, in my opinion. And the reason why I say this is because something like safe consumption sites are something that are too radical for people. But when you don't know about dosing, when you don't when you drink, there's a certain amount of alcohol that we know don't drive if you drank this much, or we have a way to gauge that. Big Pharma has pills. With some of them pills are mad. I mean, it's like we were self-medicating in many ways, right? But there's a way where if certain things aren't criminalized, you have access to drug education, like how not to die, right? Like what is too much. Now, for me, if I'm using drugs and I'm maintaining my life's goals, right, then that is not an issue, right? But if I, can no longer, right, sustain my own life goals, if my only life goals is to stay loaded, if I have lost my way, right, if I feel like I have lost my way, then I may have a drug problem. I may be addicted. And if I am addicted, right, if I am addicted, currently treatment centers only provide treatment if you agree, like for total abstinence. So there aren't groups that teach people about should you use, right? This is a way not to die, right? Like here's some strategies on how to stay alive, because if you leave this rehab, if you leave this jail, if you leave this prison, your tolerance may be at a lower level. You've lost your tolerance level. So when you go out on the street and when you use, right, you may die, right? So the lack of education around drugs exists because of the war on drugs. So all this, right, is by design. So when you cut off connection, like if you're getting drunk or getting high on in the park, that's public consumption, right? You get charged with like being out in public space, right? But if people don't have homes, if people are impoverished, right? If people have nowhere to go, then you're putting them in a situation, right, where they're going to put themselves in a situation seeking that human connection, right, where now they're going to be met with all these other charges. So now the drug use and the criminality are assigned together, right? Unless it becomes legal, like a cigarette. Like if I'm smoking a cigarette, I'm not going to jail. I'm not going to be penalized. But in some states, if I smoke a joint in public, that might be like too wild, right? So I don't know if that made sense, Lex. I don't know what comes up
Well,
for
what
you.
you both said makes perfect sense. And so I want to tie it together, and then we're kind of going to be at time, and you know this is going to be a several part conversation, so we're going to stay talking
Sure.
about this. And but how you mentioned the criminalization of public space creates the pipeline. That's that's intentional. You mentioned also how the intergenerational disruption of the carceral system is also intentional and also creates the problem. And Vanessa and I have talked about this a lot, which is the person passing the skills down to you getting taken out of your life creates a huge opening for engaging in the so-called, underground economy. If the skills building gets intentionally taken away from your life, what are you supposed to do? But then you also said a thing that I think moves into what you just said, Vanessa, when you kind of ended up giving this really perfect overview of what we would call, harm reduction, which I'm coming to like not like that term. But you said a lot of youth don't know they're allergic because there's no discourse, there's no space, there's no support to even understand that about themselves. And you then said, Vanessa, how when something's made illicit, when something's made illegal, when something is criminalized, then that bars us from any education about it or for any ability to understand our experience of it. And I've always said any kind of abstinence only based programming, it's like telling someone if you don't want to get a cold, don't breathe. It's the most backward and problematic and harmful idea that could proliferate at all. And it comes not from the desire to give better impacts or create a better world or have a safer society. It comes from a place of judgment and preying on the anxieties people have about other people. And we know that's our biggest problem. And it also preys on the other intergenerational issue, which is a lot of us as we get older somehow forget what we were doing. So, if I had a dime for every time someone who I remember being crazy and out here just doing all kinds of wild things, and now they're over here talking about, oh, the kids today are so fast and the kids today are doing so much bad stuff. I'm like, what are you talking about? The 90s was like we were ducking under the windowsills in the 90s because they were doing drive-by shootings in the 90s. What are you talking about? It was way worse. It was way worse if we're talking about violence and drugs. So whatever we're not doing to deal with our own issues, our own shame, our own guilt, and we take it out on the youth end up being so easy to criminalize. So there's a psychological dynamic. There's a collective psychological dynamic of I'm gonna project my shame onto the next generation because they can't defend themselves, and I'm gonna pretend like they're over here doing things worse than what we were doing. So there's that dissonance as well. But I digress because the real point was you ended up talking about how how people, when something is not made criminalized, people can refine their experience of it and learn how to be safe. And you mentioned, whiskey. The whiskey folks were drinking during Prohibition was killing them because no one knew what was in it. Now you can go buy a bottle of scotch and know exactly what not refinery, exactly what distillery it was it was made at, where it was aged, what kind of wood they used in the aging process, what beautiful valley in Scotland produced the water, and you get the whole story around it, and you pretend that you can taste all the elements, not pretend because you can't. You can taste the elements in that scotch, where it was made. Does it have a coastal character to it? What do they call it? Terre noir in I'm butchering the term, but where they in the wine tasting world, they say you can taste the land, you can taste the terrain that it was grown in. In the whiskey world, they say you can taste where it was aged because was it salty sea air versus something more inland, and it's got this character, and there's this whole connoisseurship involved in it. The same goes for tobacco, where the different type of cigar based on the leaf, where was it grown, where was it, who crafted it, and you get to learn your relationship with the product. And when those things are made illegal, that's not what happens. They get marginalized into essentially being poisoned, but also everybody gets denied the opportunity to educate themselves on what they're experiencing and how to experience it safely. And then on top of that, you mentioned safe consumption sites. And what's it goes back to the thing we said about companionship. One way or the other, people are going to try to create safe consumption sites for themselves. People who are going to use are going to try to do it as safely as possible. But criminalization forces everybody out of safety. And safe consumption sites, nothing works more. Let's say all you care about is lowering crime. Nothing works more than safe consumption sites. But the idea of it really disturbs people because, the United States was founded by Puritans, and there's a deep, deep, deep-seated thing in the culture here of being really upset when somebody is doing something for themselves that feels good. And it's especially projected onto certain things that they would call vices. So everything that you guys both just said really encapsulates this gap between impacts that make the society we live in safer versus the comfort of the person not actually experiencing it. I don't like thinking about them over there doing that, even though criminalizing, marginalizing, tearing families apart, inciting state violence makes all of us far less safe. The more you deny people access to doing anything for themselves, the less safe any of us are, versus the things that you just laid out, which create much more safety, but force folks to have to process how they feel about it. And these are all openings for much longer conversations, but I feel like the points that you guys nailed were so correct. And it begs a deeper question because I know we all, fortunately slash unfortunately for us, we don't get to just talk about it. We have to go incorporate this analysis into our work, and I know you guys are doing that. And one of the things we all have to figure out is how do we surface that analysis so that folks have to respond to what's true when there's a set of multi-million dollar propaganda campaigns that have been going on for at least 100 years to demonize substance use and many other forms of interactions that exist between people. So as we wrap up, I'd like to hear from both of you one last time. Quickly, quickly, what's a point you both would want to make about what we all just said before we finish? What's something you want people to understand that you're seeing maybe not being understood enough, or just a point you want to kind of compound?
Yeah, I think in the aspect of Minnesota, I really want people to understand where Minnesota is going right now and the targeting of our young people. And especially with how the news is positioning our unhoused youth, our unhoused community. Minnesota just had a shooting, a mass shooting here a few days ago where they shot up a unhoused encampment. Um, and and about what 10 people were harmed. And I really want folks to start really thinking about what we are consuming by the media, right? We're consistently talking about folks um, who are making decisions, who are using other social media, and how it really makes us view our young folks and then rationalize the abuse that they're doing when we just had a mass shooting where youth were drastically impacted, and our mayor here is positioning it as if it was their fault because they're in an area where they created their own community. That's where they live and where they also use as their fault. Um, so yeah, it's a big difference like of the way we are rationalizing the abuse of our young people of our community is going to come to a point where those youth are gonna they're gonna show out. And to be honest, I'm ready for them to show out because no one's listening to them at this point.
Let's try to do this again. And I know you guys are out there together, but let's have you on again too, and pick up this combo later. It's really exciting to have your analysis and some of the work you guys are doing. And I know there was that shooting in Minnesota that, like, I wish we could talk more about. So maybe next week we do. So maybe we can set up a like a three-way dialogue to talk more about that. Would you be open to that? Can we schedule it together? Vanessa can loop us over text and email. So let's
Okay.
pick this up later. Thank you guys for joining us. We'll get your info so that Geronimo can put it in the description. Vanessa, thank you so much. And this is like a part one of many. All right. So we'll talk soon. Okay. Thank you guys a ton.